What's going on YouTube? It's braxtech again, and today I have another laptop for you guys to check out with me. I'm going to just run through some of the specs real quick at a high level, and then we'll get into it. So this laptop right here is running an i9-13950HX, which is a 24-core, 32-thread CPU. Very similar in performance to the 13900HX and 13980HX. There's just some minor differences in boost clocks. It has an RTX 4080 12 gig running up to 175 watts after dynamic boost, which is very incredible for Razer to do. I'm so glad that they finally made that step in the right direction for performance. It has 32 gigs of DDR5 5600 MHz memory running in dual channel, so very fast SODIMMs. I'm very happy to see that as well. It has a 1 terabyte Gen 4 NVMe SSD, and I posted the specs up on the screen for you guys to take a look at for aftermarket benchmarks and things like that for read and write speeds. It has a QHD 16:10 240Hz IPS display rated for 500 nits and covers 100% of the DCI P3 color gamut. So as you can imagine, it's very beautiful to look at. Even though it's not mini LED, it is still very, very gorgeous. And lastly, it has a 95 watt-hour battery and comes with a 330 watt gallium nitride power adapter. So getting right into it, let's talk about the chassis, right? So single piece of aluminum, CNC milled, black finished. It's gorgeous. Like, it feels really, really good in your hands. There's no flex. There's no creaking. There really isn't much to say about it other than it picks up fingerprints like crazy still, even though Razer said there's like an anti-fingerprint coating to this. That's definitely not the case. So if you're carrying this around, make sure you have like a microfiber cloth or something, because those fingerprints can get nasty or gnarly pretty quick and get all of the finger oil and hand oil on it. It's not pretty to look at. So if you don't have one of these on there, maybe consider a D-brand skin so you don't have to keep constantly wiping it down. But other than that, I mean, I've loved Razer's physical chassis, like physical build quality, for quite a while. Like, this thing has zero flex on the keyboard deck, and don't mind the fingerprints. This thing, you could pick it up on any corner, and this thing does not bend or flex in any way. There's no creaking, and I'm really trying to torque this thing. And honestly, this is why I've loved Razer for quite a while. Even if their power limits were low or their thermals weren't great, like, it still feels like a well-built machine, and that's important to me, and it might be important to you too when considering this in terms of a purchasing decision. So just some things to keep in mind. It's not groundbreaking. The design doesn't change or wander much from prior generations. The only major difference compared to last gen is that it's a bit thicker, right? It's a bit thicker and heavier to accommodate a bigger vapor chamber and some beefier cooling, as well as, there's two M.2 drives, a bigger battery. It's 95 watt hours. So, I mean, outside of the weight penalty for it, I think the weight increase is definitely worth the trade-off of the performance that you're going to be able to get out of this machine, which we'll talk about in a bit. And just for your reference, so I went ahead and grabbed my other Razer blade from 2019, a Mercury white one that I still love. I still am very partial to the white aluminum or silver aluminum design. But you can definitely tell that there's a good little increase in terms of the physical size or the Z height. And then I'll go ahead and move this on top of the other one so you can kind of get a rough idea. But honestly, I mean, when you look at it, it's pretty negligible. And when you're carrying it on your back, I don't really think you're going to feel a 0.8 pound difference or 0.9 pound difference. I think maybe the physical size, because it's deeper, and I'll try to move that. So, here we go. So you could tell that there's an extra, I don't know, maybe a few centimeters on the end there to accommodate the depth of the new 16-inch display. But I think all of these changes are pretty minor in terms of what you're getting out of it. And I think most people aren't going to complain too much if they're coming from an older generation like this one. All right, moving along, let's take a look at some of the ports. So on the left-hand side here, we have the power connector, two USB-A 3.2 ports, one USB-C that supports power delivery and display out, and a combo audio headphone jack. And then on the right-hand side, we have a full-size SD card slot, UHS 2 speeds, I believe, a Thunderbolt 4 port, another Type-A, HDMI 2.1, and a Kensington lock. So honestly, I feel like the port selection is actually pretty balanced. It has a good amount of Type-A, good amount of Type-C. The HDMI supports full 2.1 bandwidth, so it could do 4K 120Hz, which this machine's power certainly can handle it. So I don't have any complaints really about how Razer really arranged the ports. I do think, however, they need to get rid of this stupid right angle connector from the charger. Let me go grab that. So this thing, when plugged in this way, will block your front USB-A port, and I'll go ahead and show that for you guys. So you always have to remember to plug it in the other way. That very clearly blocks that. So hopefully they get rid of that angle. I know it's nice when plugged in the other way because it makes a nice angle out away from the laptop. But honestly, I'm not a fan of it. I'd much rather like either straight on or some sort of different connector that isn't proprietary, because getting a replacement charger for this is also pretty expensive. So that's really my only complaint otherwise about the ports. All right, so moving on to the display. So my unit and all 4080 units, unfortunately, cannot be configured with the mini LED like dual display that's offered on the 4090 and 4070 models, which is a bit unfortunate. I was really hoping to take a look at the mini LED display and see that crazy like 1100 nits peak brightness. But don't get me wrong, like this IPS panel still looks great. It offers great color gamut coverage, like 100% DCI-P3. It's 240 hertz. It's 16 by 10, 2560 by 1600. It's damn close to 500 nits. I think my measurement came in at like 480 nits in the center. And I mean, it looks great. I don't see any ghosting when I'm playing like fast-paced games. I haven't really had any complaints with it. I think there are better options now. I don't know if I really trust OLED on laptops yet, because I don't think they get quite bright enough until quantum dot or maybe even micro LED comes around. But I don't really think I'd trade this for much other than perhaps a mini LED display that would get brighter in terms of peak brightness. But otherwise, I think this thing looks great. It performs well. And I think any content creator would also be just fine with this, even though it doesn't potentially get as bright as some of the competition. I think color coverage and color gamut accuracy is damn good for this. So one of the major improvements I would say between last year and this year is in the trackpad. So the trackpad from last year and the last few years were not bad. They've all been glass and they track smoothly. However, this year it's huge. Like most people would be worried about palm rejection, which I did all of my testing on the latest firmware that was available from Razer, which apparently did correct some of the palm rejection issues that people were reporting online on Reddit and Best Buy. I haven't had any issues with palm rejection. I think this is an awesome trackpad. It's massive. It's damn close to the MacBook Pro 16 trackpad in terms of quality and in terms of usability, which is a compliment. Pretty much all of Apple's trackpad like mechanics and usability are very high on the list. The keyboard has the same layout. I've never really been a huge fan of the keyboards on Razer. They're usable, they're passable. There's not a ton of travel to them. They don't feel very good. I mean, they're not loud or anything like that. They wouldn't annoy you. And you can get up to speed pretty quickly. Some people might have some issues with like the arrow layout. But I mean, to me, it's like passable. I'm not a huge fan of the actual typing experience on it. The chroma lighting on it does look really, really good. If you're really into that, but me personally, I probably would set this on a white backlight and that would be it. Really, other than that, I think the input devices on this, the highlight of it anyway, is definitely the trackpad. One last thing I wanted to touch on are the top firing speakers here. They're not quite Apple MacBook Pro quality, like they don't get as loud and they're not as good. They just don't sound as good. However, I would say that I would put them probably at the same level as like the XPS 15 and 17, which are also towards the top of the list in terms of Windows-based machines. I don't think you're going to like be blown away by them, but they are certainly towards the top of the list in terms of what's available in the Windows ecosystem. All right, so getting inside is pretty easy. There was 8 Torx screws. They're still pretty soft, so make sure if you take this apart to not strip it, make sure you're using the correct size bit. I used Torx 5 T5s, and I was able to get in just fine. No clips, really easy. As you could tell, there's a few ribbon cables that are like taped onto the vapor chamber, so if you wanted to get into this thing and repaste it, you're going to spend some time taking off that tape and disconnecting those ribbon cables. One's probably for the webcam, one is probably for the display, if it's like the prior generations. The fan blade design doesn't look really too complicated or over-engineered or anything, and they're pretty quiet. They max out at around 52, 53 decibels at max fans, so certainly not overbearing or too loud compared to the likes of like Acer or MSI's Titan, which can hit over 60. There are 2 DIMM slots. These again are running at 5600 megahertz in dual channel. The Wi-Fi card is replaceable right here. I have an AX211 Wi-Fi card. The M.2 slots, they're stacked on top of each other, so I don't think you can get away with using two like double-sided M.2s, so I'd probably stick to 4 terabyte models or smaller if you're planning to use 2 of them. And then the bottom here is the 95 watt-hour battery, which this generation comes with a 2-year warranty, and you can actually limit the charging in BIOS to, I think, 60 or 80%. I think it's configurable. So it's not, I know prior generations were plagued with like bloating issues, but now because there's an ability to limit the charge as well as a 2-year warranty, I think most people can take comfort or have a peace of mind about that. The other thing I wanted to talk about, so I went ahead and looked online. There is a 4th screw here. So there is the CPU mount's right here and the GPU mount is right here. They both are using a 4-point mounting solution. So if you did want to liquid metal the CPU and apply some aftermarket thermal paste on the GPU, you certainly can. I don't think you'll have too difficult of a time getting a nice even flush mount with your silicon and your dies. Honestly, I think layout-wise, Razer did a good job making sure not to waste much space here. I'm a little disappointed to have the ribbon cables again going over the vapor chamber, which definitely gets in the way and can impede the ease of access to repasting, which this unit, and I'll get into detail, kind of needs, unfortunately. Even though it performs well, it does run quite a bit hot. That's my only major complaint. I'm glad the SODIMMs are replaceable, 2 M.2 drives, batteries replaceable, Wi-Fi cards replaceable. Everything else that you would want in case it goes bad is replaceable on your own without too much difficulty. So no major complaints other than the ribbon cables and tape. All right, so let's get into the synthetic benchmark so we can start talking about performance. So I plotted the Razer Blade 16 up against the Legion Pro 7i, which has a very similar CPU and identical GPU. They both have the same GPU power limits as well, so this should be assuming that the Razer Blade doesn't have any thermal issues, at least in the shorter benchmarks, that they should have pretty similar performance. And looking at the chart, it certainly does. So all of these tests were ran with a plus 150 core and plus 500 memory GPU overclock. And for the CPU, I ran all of them with a negative 75 millivolts core offset using throttle stop where available. So we'll go ahead and get right into it. So superposition actually showed a very slight favor within margin of error, honestly, to the Legion Pro 7i. I don't think there's going to be any sort of major performance differences in GPU-only workloads. Any sort of differences are going to come down to binning and temperatures under load. Moving on, we have Cinebench R23, just a single run. The blade is limited to 130 watts. I was able to eke out just over 31,000 points in a single run compared to the 33,000 points in the Legion, which offers up to 190 watts in terms of short-term power limit. Before that expired, the test was over, so the difference in score is mainly stemming from the power limits that are available from the machine from the factory. Moving on, we have Firestrike Extreme, so there is a slight edge, almost 10% performance benefit over to the Legion Pro 7i, largely because of the increased CPU power limits in dual load. Port Royale was interesting. It actually showed a slight edge to the Razer Blade 16, and I think this is largely due to, again, binning. I think the GPU that I have in the Blade 16, it does slightly better per watt, as in it can clock higher within the same 175 watt TGP envelope compared to my Legion. So it was a nice little impressive showing there in a GPU only or ray traced workload. And then finally we have the combined Time Spy scores. Again, the Legion coming in with a 400 point lead, not anything really major to talk about. The Legion just had a slightly higher CPU score, and again, this is largely due to the power limits and cooling that are available in the Legion. The Legion has a very impressive CPU cooling, so anytime it's either dual load or CPU only workloads, there's definitely going to be some performance benefits going over to the Legion. So the next two benchmarks I have are two games using the in-game benchmark tool. Both run at 1440p, and I chose both of these titles, and I continue to choose these titles because I think they use both the CPU and GPU pretty heavily, especially at a medium resolution like 1440p, so both of the components have to stretch their legs quite a bit. So on the top, we see there's a roughly 3% lead to the Legion at Modern Warfare 2, which is not anything significant. I do think that the main differences there are going to be, again, coming from significantly better CPU cooling in the Legion. And then Shadow of the Tomb Raider actually showed a pretty identical score here at 168 for the Legion and 167 for the Blade. So overall, a very impressive showing for the Blade, even though it is smaller and lighter than the Legion, and is also not using any sort of fancy thermal interface material. So no liquid metal on the CPU and no phase change material on the GPU, unlike Lenovo. So they're just using a standard run-of-the-mill paste from the factory. So very impressive so far, at least in terms of performance. All right, so moving into thermal performance. So I went ahead and ran the same test that I did in my prior video, which is using AIDA64 to simultaneously stress the CPU and GPU to pull 150 watts and 75 watts respectively for each component. Both laptops were ran with max fans enabled with the rear elevated ever so slightly, and ran the test for 10 minutes. So immediately, as I wanted to call out, the Blade 16 for some reason would not pull more than 50 watts when cross-loaded, which doesn't really make sense because in some of the gaming benchmarks that I ran, I definitely saw more than 50 watts while the GPU was also loaded. So something to point out, I tried messing with Synapse to try to override it, like XTU, throttle stop, restarting it, uninstalling some services. No matter what I did, I really couldn't get it to pull more than 50 watts for the purposes of this test, so it's a little unfortunate. So it's not necessarily apples to apples comparison with the Legion, but moving on, GPU power was basically the same. It was pulling 2 watts more on average in the Razer Blade, so nothing really too significant to affect the thermal results. Then, as you can see, the Blade 16 ran about 14 degrees warmer than the Legion, and this is probably mostly due to the fact that Razer decided to not really do anything different with their thermal interface material. Every single other manufacturer out there, Asus is using liquid metal, MSI is using a liquid metal pad, Alienware is using Element 51, which is a conductive material with some barriers in place. Lenovo's using liquid metal and PTM 7950 for their GPUs. So it's a little disappointing to see a nearly $4,000 device after tax to not really innovate or change what TIM they're using to better their thermals, especially with this already cresting close to 90 degrees in a 10-minute run. I can't imagine this gets much better if you try to run it for 20, 30, 40 minutes, especially without the rear elevated. The other hand, though, the GPU actually ran pretty nicely. It only ran at 78 degrees versus 76 in the Legion, while also being 30%-ish quieter. It ran at 53.5 decibels versus 56.7 in the Legion. And the noise profile from the Razer is very pleasant. I will say it's not obnoxious in any sense. The profile is more of like a low whooshy sound. It's not like loud or whiny or high-pitched. So definitely pleasant. I think any advanced user would probably be happy with the thermal results if they replaced the thermal interface material, both the CPU and GPU, with probably liquid metal for the CPU and maybe a high quality aftermarket paste like KPX or Phobia Nanogrease Extreme, or if you can get your hands on PTM 7950 from like eBuy7 or Taobao or AliExpress, I think there's probably a lot of thermal headroom left on the table because of a poor thermal interface material that was chosen by Razer. All right, so a few more like anecdotal or miscellaneous callouts that I wanted to talk about that don't really fit into a specific category. So one thing, battery life, this thing's actually not too bad. I'm getting pretty close to 6 hours with 50% brightness and at 60 hertz in iGPU mode. Just doing some light stuff, so like YouTube, Excel, Spotify, like nothing too crazy, not doing any sort of like Blender renders or anything. But yeah, close to 6 hours versus I was getting around 5 on the Legion, even though the Legion had a bigger battery. So Razer did a good job at least tuning the power profiles and everything like that out of the factory. Next thing I wanted to talk about that I was actually particularly impressed with is the 330 watt gallium nitride charger or power adapter from Razer. It's only 2 pounds and is pretty compact for the amount of power that I can pass through to the laptop. Considering the last MSI I've owned and the last Legion I owned were like significantly larger than this, I was actually quite impressed with what Razer was able to cram into this little power brick. So kudos to them for that. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about actually was when I first purchased this laptop. The factory image from Razer actually did not have the internal display working. And I tried toggling between the iGPU and DGPU modes within the BIOS because like the screen worked to access the BIOS or do things like that before booting into the OS. But the moment Windows loaded, the internal display would turn off. and I connected it to an external monitor and tried toggling it on and off or changing all the display options and even reinstalling graphics drivers, and I could not get the internal display to turn on. So I ended up having to wipe Windows entirely with a separate ISO on a flash drive, and I got everything working through that way. But I did want to call it out because if you're not a particularly advanced user or don't feel like dealing with that in terms of a unboxing experience, that could be pretty crippling for anybody that's purchased this laptop and just wants to plug and play. Like, if that happens to someone, I don't blame them in the least if they want to return their unit right away, especially after spending $3,700 on this. So just to call out. All right, so wrapping up, the Razer Blade 16. It's very fast, it's quiet compared to its competition, it runs hot, and it's well built. I think that's probably the fastest way to summarize the entire chassis and the entire design in one single sentence. The audience for this is probably pretty small. The audience has to care about performance, size, weight, build, and don't mind paying a premium for having all of those things in a single package. This unit starts at $35.99 before tax and any sort of extended warranty, so it is very expensive. But I think if you fall into that audience that Razer's trying to cater to that cares about all of those things together, I think you'd be happy with the device, even though it is coming at a premium. If you don't particularly care if your laptop is partially plastic or isn't as compact or things like that, there are cheaper options that compete with it in terms of performance. But in terms of an overall package, price aside, the Razer Blade is quite gorgeous to look at and quite nice to use outside of my minor nitpicks with the keyboard. So, well guys, that wraps up today's review of the Razer Blade 16. I hope it was informative and you guys learned something, or I hope I helped you guys in a purchasing decision because I know it's an expensive one. But that's about it, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.